December 16th, 1944. Before first light, the Ardennes Forest breathes in silence. Not the comfortable silence of peace, but the suspended, held-breath silence of something enormous gathering itself at the edge of the world. Snow has been falling since the previous evening, not gently, but with the indifferent weight of a continent exhaling cold into men's bones. The pines carry it like a burden. The roads have vanished beneath it, and the temperature in the Belgian highlands has dropped to -7 degrees Celsius, which is the kind of cold that does not merely chill, it teaches a man what he is made of, layer by layer, until the lesson becomes unbearable. Somewhere in a shallow foxhole at the edge of a forest road, a young American soldier from the 106th Infantry Division pulls his coat tighter and watches the gray horizon. He has been in Europe for fewer than 3 weeks. He has not yet seen true combat. He holds in his hands a canteen of coffee that has already gone cold, and beside his foxhole, half buried in snow, sits a Willys MB quarter-ton Jeep, small, ungainly, olive drab, its flat hood dusted white, its narrow frame shuddering slightly in the wind. And bolted to a field-welded pintle mount above the passenger seat, at a cant that no Army regulation had ever formally blessed, sits a Browning M250 caliber heavy machine gun. Its barrel juts forward into the gray morning like an accusation. 3 hours earlier, a regimental supply officer had pointed at that Jeep and laughed. He had told the men responsible for it that they were operating outside of protocol, that the M2 was a weapon for tanks and aircraft, that a quarter-ton Jeep was not built to absorb the recoil of a weapon that fired rounds the size of a man's thumb at 600 per minute. He had written a notation. He had used the word irregular. Some of the men in earshot used a simpler word. They said illegal. And they laughed. At 5:30 in the morning on December 16th, 1944, the laughter stopped. To understand what was about to descend upon the Ardennes, you must first understand what Germany believed the Ardennes to be. In the autumn of 1944, the Western Front had been grinding toward Germany with relentless Allied momentum. Paris had been liberated. The Low Countries were being reclaimed village by village. The Wehrmacht, once the most formidable land army the modern world had ever assembled, was bleeding from 2 directions simultaneously, its eastern flank chewed apart by Soviet armies driving toward Berlin, its western flank pressed backward by American, British, and Canadian forces, who refused, despite every German calculation, to break. Hitler's generals had grown quiet in their briefings. Maps told stories that ideology could not explain away. But Hitler had one last card, and he believed it was an ace. He called his plan Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, a name chosen deliberately for its defensive resonance, designed to deceive Allied intelligence into believing it was merely a repositioning. The true objective was nothing less than to split the Allied line from the Ardennes to the coast, capture the critical port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace before the Americans and British could recover. The plan required surprise, speed, and the exploitation of what German intelligence had correctly identified as the weakest sector of the Allied line, a thinly spread, inexperienced, and in some places exhausted stretch of American formations holding the dense forests of Belgium and Luxembourg. The Ardennes sector had been deliberately quieted by Allied command. It was considered by many officers a rest sector, a place to rotate battle-worn divisions and introduce green ones. The terrain was deemed too rugged for a major offensive thrust. The forest roads were narrow. The winter was brutal. No serious army would attempt a large-scale armored offensive through 80 miles of frozen pines in the dead of December. This was the comfortable assumption that made the Ardennes both a logical choice for German planners and a catastrophic blind spot for Allied ones. Hitler committed over 200,000 German troops to the assault. Nearly 1,000 tanks, Panthers and King Tigers among them, were marshaled in staging areas behind the Siegfried Line under strict radio silence and night movement disciplines that had not been seen since the opening years of the war. More than 1,600 artillery pieces were positioned along an assault frontage of roughly 60 miles. The supply calculations alone were staggering. 1 million gallons of captured or hoarded fuel, much of it earmarked to sustain the advance until the armored spearheads could seize American fuel depots intact. At 5:30 in the morning on December 16, those 1,600 guns opened fire simultaneously, and the Ardennes, that quiet, frozen, supposedly inconsequential corner of the Western Front, erupted into the loudest sound in the history of that war. The German High Command had made a series of precise calculations, and they were not entirely wrong. They had correctly identified the weakness of the American line. They had correctly predicted that the weather would ground Allied air power for the critical opening days. They had correctly assumed that the shock of the initial assault would create chaos in American communications and command structures. What they had not fully calculated, what ideology and arrogance together conspired to underestimate, was the character of the American soldier when cornered, and the extraordinary depth of material power that a democratic industrial economy could concentrate into even the most unlikely of platforms. They had not calculated the Jeep. The Willys MB was, by every rational standard, not a weapon of war. It weighed approximately 2,300 pounds, fully loaded. Its engine was a 134 cubic inch four-cylinder block that the soldiers called the Go Devil, producing 60 horsepower, enough to push the small vehicle to a top speed of 55 miles per hour on a flat road, and enough torque in four-wheel drive to pull itself through mud, snow, and shattered terrain that would have swallowed conventional vehicles entirely. With some 640,000 units eventually produced across the war, the Jeep constituted nearly a quarter of all military support motor vehicles manufactured by the United States during the conflict. It was everywhere. It was cheap. It was simple enough for a 19-year-old from Indiana to maintain with a wrench and 40 minutes of attention. But stripped to its essential purpose, the Jeep was a utility vehicle. It was designed to carry officers, run messages, tow light equipment, and traverse terrain that would confound heavier transport. It was not, by any official Army doctrine in December of 1944, designed to serve as a mobile weapons platform for a weapon class that belonged to aircraft and armored fighting vehicles. The M2 Browning 50 caliber heavy machine gun was something else entirely. John Browning had conceived the weapon in the final months of the First World War, answering General Pershing's specific request for a machine gun capable of defeating the armored vehicles that were just beginning to shape the new face of war. What Browning produced was less a weapon than a principle, a statement about what American mechanical ingenuity could concentrate into a single instrument of controlled destruction. By the time the Second World War reached its terrible maturity, the M2 was present in the air above every theater of operations, on the deck of every warship large enough to carry it, in the ring mounts of half-tracks and the sponsons of aircraft. It fired a cartridge 12 and 7/10 millimeters in diameter. A 50 BMG round that left the barrel at roughly 2,900 feet per second, carrying enough kinetic energy to penetrate light armor, shred wooden fortifications, and render a human body into a forensic argument against the dignity of war. Its cyclic rate of fire stood between 450 and 600 rounds per minute. Its effective range against ground targets reached 1,830 meters. Against soft targets and lightly skinned vehicles, the weapon operated at distances that made the encounter effectively one-sided. What a handful of American soldiers had done, somewhere in the supply chain chaos of the autumn of 1944, when the official procurement system could not move fast enough to arm the Jeeps formally, when the field expedient demanded a solution that regulations had not yet caught up with, was to take this aircraft weapon, this tank weapon, and weld a mount for it onto a quarter-ton utility vehicle that weighed less than a compact automobile. They had reinforced the pintle. They had braced the frame where they could. They had solved the problem the way American soldiers across that war repeatedly solved problems, with ingenuity born of necessity, with tools borrowed from another purpose, and with an institutional tolerance for creative improvisation that no German manual had thought to prepare its officers to understand or respect. Officers who encountered the unauthorized configuration in the field shook their heads. Some filed notations. Some called the modification dangerous. One unit record from the period notes that a superior officer, seeing the configuration for the first time, declared it against all standard mechanical principle. The soldiers who had built it, and who trusted it with their lives, said nothing back. They smiled, perhaps. They waited for the Forest to make the argument for them. The Forest made it on December 16th, and then again on the 17th, and then every day for the 6 weeks that followed. The German offensive, in its first 48 hours, achieved a degree of tactical success that genuinely alarmed Allied Supreme Command. The American 106th Infantry Division, green, cold, and suddenly facing the full weight of the 6th Panzer Army, suffered catastrophically. Two of its regiments, the 422nd and the 423rd, were encircled and forced to surrender in what became the largest capitulation of American forces in the European theater since the fall of Bataan. German armored columns punched through gaps in the line with a speed that, for brief hours, recalled the terrifying momentum of the 1940 Blitzkrieg. The word bulge entered the vocabulary of that war as an accurate cartographic description of what the German offensive had created in the Allied line. A deep, dangerous westward salient that threatened to fracture everything to its north and south. But the bulge could not move fast enough. And it could not move fast enough in part because of what it encountered, repeatedly and catastrophically, in the narrow forest roads that threaded through the Ardennes highlands. The Jeep with the .50 caliber mount was not a singular invention. By December 1944, the configuration had spread through American units with the organic, unofficial efficiency of a field solution that worked. It appeared in the equipment of cavalry reconnaissance squadrons probing ahead of armored columns. It appeared at roadblocks thrown together by whoever happened to be present: military policemen, quartermaster troops, artillerymen without their guns. It appeared in the hands of paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, rushed into the battle from their rest billets, with almost nothing except their weapons and the burning institutional will to hold a line. At Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne Division under Acting Commander Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe anchored the southern flank of the American resistance in the most famous siege of the Western Campaign, the defensive perimeter was held by a patchwork of units, weapons, and improvisations that collectively demonstrated what American democratic war-making looked like at the operational level. It looked like a quartermaster sergeant rerouting supply convoys under fire. It looked like tankers from the 10th Armored Division fighting as infantry because there was no other option. And it looked like small, maneuverable, quarter-ton vehicles bristling with weapons that their designers had never intended for them, running through snow-buried forest lanes to arrive at crisis points faster than the German tactical system could anticipate or prevent. The Ardennes Forest was, in a profound operational sense, the ideal environment for the .50 caliber Jeep. The trees were dense enough to channel armored movement onto roads and fire breaks. The roads were narrow enough to create bottlenecks where a single vehicle engaging an advancing column from a flanking position could achieve a disruption vastly disproportionate to its size. The M2 Browning, firing 600 rounds per minute at ranges well beyond the response capacity of infantry rifles, could disable the lead vehicle of a column, scatter the accompanying infantry into the trees, and be gone, engine roaring, tracks cutting fresh channels in the snow. Before the German unit commander had fully processed what had hit him. German soldiers who survived the Ardennes campaign and subsequently offered written accounts of the experience returned, with a consistency that historians have noted, to a specific quality of dread attached to the American weapons they could not see. The forest, they wrote, was alive with American fire, from sources that appeared and vanished. The small, fast vehicles were described in German field reports with a mixture of tactical frustration and something approaching professional bewilderment. They were too small to engage effectively with the anti-tank weapons that anchored German defensive doctrine. They moved faster than infantry could pursue. And when they fired with a weight of projectile and a rate of delivery that had no business emerging from something so light and so small. It was German soldiers themselves who gave the armed Jeep its most enduring nickname. Among the panzer crews and the grenadiers pushing through the Ardennes, the small vehicle with its enormous weapon came to be called Eiserne Wespe, the Iron Wasp. The name was precise in its involuntary poetry. A wasp is not large. A wasp does not announce itself with the thunderous declaration of an approaching Panther tank or the earth-shaking report of an 88mm gun. A wasp is agile, unpredictable, and capable of delivering a sting that is grotesquely disproportionate to its apparent size. And like a wasp encountered in an enclosed space, the iron wasp was most dangerous precisely because it could not be cornered, could not be pinned, and seemed to emerge from everywhere at once. Consider for a moment what the German soldier in the Ardennes had been told to expect. He had been told that the American soldier was soft, a product of a consumer civilization that had never truly hardened its young men for the realities of modern industrialized war. He had been told that American material advantage was offset by tactical inferiority, by a military culture that relied too heavily on machines and not enough on the will of the individual soldier. He had been told, above all, that the offensive through the Ardennes would achieve the shock and speed necessary to overrun whatever patchwork resistance the Americans could assemble before the industrial weight of the Allied war machine could be brought to bear. What the German soldier found instead was a phenomenon that Nazi ideology had no framework to explain. He found an army that improvised with an almost casual fluency, that took weapons designated for one purpose and attached them to platforms designated for another, not in violation of its institutional character, but as a direct expression of it. He found soldiers who, when their command structure collapsed, did not wait for orders, but consulted their own judgment and found it sufficient. He found a vehicle that the American Army produced by the hundreds of thousands, powered by an engine any mechanic could service, mounting a weapon that had been welded into place by enlisted men working in the dark, with tools scavenged from a motor pool, and which, in the frozen corridors of the Ardennes Forest, proved capable of stopping a German armored offensive in its tracks. The brass shell casings of the 50 caliber round, each one nearly the length of a man's palm, golden bright even in the gray December light, scattered in their hundreds across the snow-covered forest floor after a contact, became a kind of evidence. They were not trophies. They were not monuments. They were simply the residue of an industrial fact, each casing the product of an American factory somewhere in Ohio or Michigan or Pennsylvania, each one loaded onto a ship and transported 3,000 miles and placed into the belt of a weapon that had no right to be on the vehicle carrying it, which had no right to be in the forest road where it was fired, and which had, despite every regulation and every rational calculation of appropriate use, changed the course of the largest land battle the American Army would fight in the Second World War. German logistics officers examining captured American equipment in the first days of the offensive had already encountered the broader shape of the problem. American soldiers carried rations that German soldiers could scarcely believe, concentrated, calorie-dense, individually packaged. American soldiers carried radios at the squad level. American soldiers carried ammunition in quantities that German supply chains, stretched and attenuated by the cumulative catastrophe of 4 years of two-front war, could not approach. But nothing confronted the German soldier in the Ardennes with the abstract enormity of American industrial production quite as directly as the sight and sound of a 50 caliber Browning firing from the back of a quarter-ton Jeep, a weapon that should not have been there, on a vehicle that should not have been able to carry it, operated by men who had been told it was against the rules, and who had decided, in the practical tradition of a democracy at war, that the rules had not anticipated the Ardennes in December of 1944. The Battle of the Bulge officially ended on January 25, 1945. In 6 weeks of fighting across the frozen highlands of Belgium and Luxembourg, the United States Army had suffered 89,000 casualties, 19,000 dead, making it the bloodiest single battle in American military history. The German offensive had been stopped, contained, and ultimately reversed. Hitler's last strategic gamble had consumed the reserves that might have prolonged the defense of the Reich, accelerating rather than preventing the final collapse that came 4 months later. A total of 610,000 American soldiers had ultimately been committed to the battle, and among everything they brought, tanks, artillery, fighter bombers once the weather finally cleared, the inexhaustible weight of American supply, The armed jeep persisted, moving through the forest lanes, appearing and disappearing, stinging and withdrawing, carrying its unauthorized weapon into every corner of the battle that conventional platforms could not reach. The regimental officer, who had laughed at the improvised mount, who had written the word irregular in his notation, and watched the men who built it with the comfortable disdain of authority unchallenged, left no further record of his opinion on the matter. The forest made the argument. The snow kept it. And the brass casings lay golden in the cold, scattered across the white ground like the spent evidence of something that a democracy, when forced to defend itself, is capable of conceiving and executing without asking permission from those who cannot imagine it. There is a quality of the M2 Browning .50 caliber round that no specification sheet fully captures. Hold one in your hand if history permits you such a moment, and you hold something that is at once entirely prosaic and entirely extraordinary. It is metal, shaped and loaded by machinery, identical to the tens of millions produced alongside it on the same production lines. It carries no individual identity. It bears no inscription. It knows nothing of ideology or history or the frozen forest road where it was eventually fired. And yet, in the aggregate, those rounds, those identical, anonymous, industrially democratic cartridges, represented something that the Third Reich, for all its terror and all its genius, could not manufacture in equivalent quantity or deploy with equivalent flexibility. They represented a civilization that had decided to win. A civilization that, when told something was against regulation, had asked, in the practical, unglamorous, entirely American way, against whose regulation? Exactly. And what does the forest say? What the forest said in December of 1944 was this, that the Iron Wasp was real, that the men who built it were real, that the mockery of those who called it illegal had already been answered before the laughter had finished echoing across the snow. That a democracy at war is not merely a collection of regulations and doctrines and weapons assigned to their proper platforms. It is, at its deepest and most dangerous, a culture of improvisation backed by the full weight of industrial civilization, capable of mounting the wrong weapon on the wrong vehicle and making it the most consequential piece of hardware on an 80-mile front. The Ardennes did not forgive hesitation. The cold did not reward comfort. And history, which is rarely as tidy as the manuals that precede it, recorded with its usual indifference that the weapon the officers laughed at stopped the army the world had feared. That the jeep they called too small carried the gun they called too large. That the soldiers they called too soft held the line that mattered most. And somewhere in the snow of the Belgian highlands, among the empty cartridge casings and the silent pines, in the long darkness of a winter, that eventually, inevitably, yielded to spring. There lay the simple and magnificent proof that the most dangerous thing in any war is not the largest weapon, or the most sophisticated doctrine, or the most meticulously planned offensive. The most dangerous thing in any war is a free people that has decided it will not be moved, and has, in the characteristically extravagant manner of free peoples everywhere, found a way to make something extraordinary out of what it had on hand. The .50 caliber never asked for permission. The forest never forgot its answer.